Listen to me carefully, because what I'm about to tell you happened in Lagos just 6 months ago, and the woman responsible, she's still out there. Picture this. A man walks into a nightclub, successful, confident, wearing a gold ring worth more than most people's cars. By sunrise, he's a hollow shell, broke, and that ring, gone. The woman who took it didn't steal it. She earned it through a single kiss that cost him everything he ever was, everything he'd ever become. They call her Chimamanda, Mandy for short. And before you click away thinking this is just another urban legend, hit that subscribe button, because by the end of the story, you'll understand why half of Lagos whispers her name in fear, and the other half doesn't believe she exists at all. Now, I need you to forget everything you think you know about love, about power, about the price we pay for our deepest desires. Because in Lagos, where the ancient meets the modern, where spirits walk among skyscrapers, one woman discovered that destiny itself could be stolen. One kiss at a time. Let me take you back to where this all began. Not in the glittering nightclubs or penthouse apartments, but in a village so poor that children counted grains of rice for dinner. Little Mandy, 8 years old, watching her mother trade her jewelry piece by piece just to buy medicine for her dying father. The night he died, something broke inside that little girl, not just her heart. Something deeper, something that made her whisper to the darkness, "I'll do anything to never be powerless again." And the darkness? It listened. 3 days later, an old woman appeared at their door. Not old in the way time makes you old, but old like the earth itself, like she'd been watching the world since the first sunrise. She wore white cloth that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and when she smiled, Mandy saw stars reflected in her teeth. "Child," the woman said, her voice like wind through ancient trees, "I can give you power beyond imagination. You'll never want for money, never bow to any man, never feel the sting of poverty again." She paused, and her eyes turned silver. But there's a price. Mandy's mother tried to pull her daughter away, but the girl was transfixed. "What price?" "You must steal the chai, the life force, the very destiny of men through intimacy. Each kiss, each touch, each moment of vulnerability they share with you becomes yours to command. Their fortune, their future, their fate, all of it transfers to you." "And if I refuse?" The woman's smile widened. "Then you'll live as your mother lives, powerless, poor, forgotten." But here's what that old woman didn't mention, what Mandy didn't understand until it was too late. She could never, ever fall in love. Because love would shatter the spell and cost her everything. Fast forward 20 years. Mandy's morning routine would make billionaires weep with envy. Silk sheets that cost more than most people's cars, stacks of cash from offshore accounts, diamonds that caught sunlight and threw rainbows across marble floors. But every morning, before she counts her money, before she plans her next hunt, she takes a small dose of a dark powder she calls ashe. It's not what you think. It's not a drug. It's ground bone from the sacred ritual that bound her soul to this power. And every morning, as it dissolves on her tongue like bitter ash, she remembers the taste of that first kiss and the sound of a man's destiny snapping like a dry branch. Her hunting grounds, the places where power gathers, high-end lounges where oil executives make deals worth millions. Tech conferences where young programmers celebrate their first funding. Charity galas where politicians shake hands and make promises they'll never keep. She has rules, you see, Never the same venue twice. Always leave a token behind. Something to confuse the police when they inevitably investigate. And most importantly, never let them see her true face until it's too late. Because when Mandy wants you, when she sets her sights on your destiny, you don't stand a chance. Her eyes become pools of starlight. Her voice carries the rhythm of ancient songs, and her touch feels like coming home to a place you didn't know you'd been searching for your entire life. Until you wake up the next morning and realize that home was built on the ruins of your own soul. The victims, God, the victims. Picture Lagos's most successful politician, a man who could command crowds of thousands with his voice. After one night with Mandy, he stood up in Parliament and couldn't speak above a whisper. The doctors found nothing wrong, but his hair had turned partially grey overnight, as if years of his life had simply vanished. Or the football star, 23 years old, faster than lightning on the field. One kiss from Mandy, and his legs gave out during the most important match of his career. Not injured, not sick, just empty, like someone had drained the very essence of his athletic gift. The crypto genius who built an empire on digital currency woke up to find every account he'd ever created had mysteriously transferred ownership. Not hacked, not stolen, legally transferred, as if he'd signed the papers himself while sleepwalking. Each victim bore the same mark, that grey streak in their hair, like time itself had skipped forward, leaving them aged and hollow. The doctors couldn't explain it. The police had no evidence. But in the shadows of Lagos, people began to whisper about the Night Queen, the woman who kissed men's souls right out of their bodies. That's when Pastor Kenechukwu entered the story. Keen was different from Mandy's usual targets. 28 years old, soft-spoken, wore simple clothes that spoke of humility rather than poverty. He'd come to Lagos not to build wealth, but to share it. His plan? A free coding boot camp for street children, kids who reminded him of the little boy he'd once been. But Kine carried something Mandy had never encountered before. His grandmother's Ogbonikwe bracelet, blessed with prayers from 7 generations of prayer warriors. His grandmother, may she rest in peace, had raised him on stories of spiritual warfare, had taught him to recognize evil even when it wore the face of an angel. And before she died, she'd whispered a prophecy that made his blood run cold. In the city of glass and dreams, you'll meet a silk serpent with honey words. She'll want what flows in your veins, the light your ancestors placed there. But remember, my child, darkness cannot comprehend light. The night they first met, at a charity ball for children's education, Mandy approached him like she had dozens of others, confident, magnetic, irresistible. She maneuvered the conversation, orchestrated the moment, and when he accidentally bumped her champagne glass, their hands touched. And for the first time in 20 years, Mandy's power failed. Not just failed, it recoiled, like touching a live wire, like grasping fire itself. The pain shot through her arm, her chest, her very soul, and for one terrifying moment, she couldn't breathe. Keen felt it too. The bracelet on his wrist grew warm, then hot, then burning. But instead of pain, he felt protection, like invisible armor wrapping around his spirit. That night, Mandy couldn't sleep. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time in 2 decades, she saw not the powerful Night Queen, but a frightened little girl who'd made a deal with darkness and forgotten the price of light. But giving up wasn't in her nature. If seduction wouldn't work, she'd use everything else in her arsenal. She became the anonymous benefactor of his coding boot camp, the mysterious investor who funded his dreams. She orchestrated meetings, created opportunities, slowly weaving herself into his world. Each attempt to get close to him met with the same result, that burning recoil, that sense of touching something pure and untouchable. Her candles would blow out in his presence. Mirrors cracked when she tried to spy on him through reflective surfaces. Even her dreams were blocked, filled with blinding light that made her wake up screaming. The old woman, the priestess who'd given her this power, began appearing in her visions. No longer the benevolent grandmother figure, but something ancient and hungry, with eyes like black holes and teeth like shattered glass. "You're failing me, child," the apparition would whisper. "This man's destiny burns brighter than any you've encountered. Claim it, and you'll have power beyond imagination. Fail, and I'll take back everything I've given you." So Mandy made a choice that would damn them both. She decided to use the forbidden ritual, the twin flame incantation that could steal the destiny of even the most protected soul. But this spell came with a warning written in blood on ancient scrolls. To steal light, you must touch it with darkness, and darkness that touches light burns. The retreat she organized was perfect, a coastal resort, isolated, beautiful, where the sound of waves would mask whatever supernatural battle was about to unfold. She'd invited Keen under the pretense of a strategy session for the boot camp, and like the good man he was, he'd accepted. But from the moment they arrived, the very air seemed charged with electricity. Birds slammed into windows as if the building itself repelled them. The waves struck the shore in rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Keen's bracelet pulsed constantly now, warm against his skin, and he found himself praying the psalms his grandmother had taught him, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He knew what Mandy was, even if he couldn't fully understand it, and more importantly, he knew what he was, a child of light, protected by generations of faith. The final confrontation came during what should have been a simple dinner. Candlelight, wine, the sound of waves in the distance. Mandy had never looked more beautiful, never seemed more vulnerable. When she leaned across the table, when her lips approached his, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. But the moment their lips touched, reality exploded. What happened next defies everything we think we know about the physical world. Inside the spirit realm, invisible to human eyes, but more real than the building around them, Mandy's shadow self reached out like a dark octopus, tentacles of pure hunger grasping for the golden thread that was Keen's destiny. But instead of empty air, instead of an unprotected soul, her darkness met something that made her scream in agony, a sword of pure light, wielded by generations of ancestors who died fighting evil in all its forms. The shockwave threw both of them back into the physical world. Plates crashed, lights exploded, and the very foundations of the resort groaned, as if the building itself was being torn apart by invisible hands. And that's when things got truly terrifying. Mandy's human facade fell away, like a discarded mask. Her hair swirled like living smoke. Her eyes glowed with foxfire. And from the shadows came creatures that nightmares are made of. The twisted spirits of her former victims, half man and half hyena, bound to her will by the destinies she'd stolen. But Keen stood in the center of the chaos like an island of calm. The bracelet on his wrist had erupted into rings of blue flame that formed a perfect circle around him, and from his lips came prayers in languages he'd never learned, words that carried the power of every faithful soul who'd ever stood against darkness. The battle raged until dawn, not just between two people, but between forces that had been at war since the first human chose between light and shadow. And when the sun finally rose over the destroyed resort, when the media arrived to report on the gas explosion that had leveled half the building, only one figure walked away unbroken. But this story doesn't end with victory or defeat. It ends with something far more powerful: choice. Mandy survived, but barely. The spiritual tether that connected her to the old woman, to the source of her power, had been severed but not broken. She could feel her stolen wealth beginning to crumble, her supernatural beauty starting to fade. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the possibility of redemption. In her dreams, she saw herself as a child again, not the bitter, desperate girl who'd made a deal with darkness, but the innocent child she'd been before poverty and loss had broken her heart. And that child was crying, begging for forgiveness, pleading for a chance to undo the evil she'd become. The final confrontation came 3 days later, in the bustling marina market where Mandy had been born, where her mother had sold vegetables to buy medicine for her dying father. The circle was closing, bringing her back to where it all began. Keen found her there, sitting among the fish vendors and cloth sellers, looking like any other woman trying to make sense of her life. But he could see the war raging in her eyes, the battle between the monster she'd become and the human she still was. "Break the pact," he said simply, sitting beside her on a wooden crate that smelled of salt and hope. "Return what you stole. It's not too late." Around them, invisible to the crowd, but real as the morning sun, the final battle played out. Mandy's darkness reached for him one last time, and the old woman appeared like a wraith made of shadow and fury, her voice like fingernails on glass. "Kill him, child, or lose everything." For a moment that lasted eternity, Mandy hesitated. 20 years of power, of never being hungry, never being helpless, never being afraid. All of it hanging by a thread that she could either cut or strengthen. And then she chose. The blade she drew wasn't meant for Keen. In one swift motion, she turned it on herself, cutting not her flesh, but the invisible cord that bound her soul to darkness. The scream that tore from her throat wasn't pain. It was 20 years of stolen life, rushing back to where it belonged. Golden threads of light streamed from her chest into the morning sky, raining down like shooting stars onto distant men across Lagos. The politician felt his voice return mid-sentence during a radio interview. The football star's legs regained their strength during morning practice. The crypto genius watched his accounts mysteriously restore themselves, his stolen destiny flowing back like a river returning to its source. The old woman's death shriek shattered windows across the market before she dissolved into nothing, taking with her the weight of ancient evil that had pressed down on Mandy's soul for 2 decades. And Mandy? She collapsed into Keen's arms, no longer a supernatural predator, no longer a vessel of stolen power, just a woman who'd finally remembered what it meant to be human. The aftermath reads like a redemption story, but life is never that simple. Mandy was arrested, charged with fraud and embezzlement, though the prosecutors could never quite explain how the evidence fit together. She donated her remaining assets to a scholarship fund for the children in Keene's program, and she served her sentence with a peace that puzzled everyone who met her. Keene's coding bootcamp flourished, growing from a small program to a movement that spread across West Africa. He kept Mandy's gold ring, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Power without love rots the soul, but redemption is always possible for those brave enough to choose light over darkness. And late at night, when the moon is dark and the lagoon is still, fishermen sometimes report seeing a woman made of starlight walking on the water, guiding lost boats safely to shore. They say she doesn't speak, doesn't take offerings, doesn't ask for anything except the chance to save others from the rocks that once claimed her own soul. Whether you believe that part is up to you, but the ring is real. The victims who recovered their destinies are real. And somewhere in Lagos tonight, there's a woman learning to live with the weight of redemption instead of the burden of stolen power. The price of a kiss, it turns out, wasn't what Mandy thought she was paying. It was what she learned to give back. And that changes everything. If this story gripped you the way it gripped me when I first heard it, if you're thinking about power and choice and the prices we pay for our deepest desires, then do me a favor. Share the story. Subscribe to hear more like it. Because in a world full of easy answers and comfortable lies, sometimes we need to be reminded that redemption is real, that darkness can choose light, and that every single one of us has the power to rewrite our own ending. The choice is always ours. The question is, what price are you willing to pay? And what are you willing to give back?